All right. So, welcome everybody. I appreciate literally hundreds of people deciding that this crazy idea was something that you wanted to give up time on a Thursday. And I know free CMTs is great, but I know 7 CMTs is not like the most in the world. So, you're donating your time here as well. I also just want to say thank you to the handful of people that have decided to chip in on the Gumroad download. I 100% didn't expect one penny, and I was just so like flattered that people considered, this is something that's worth even a dollar or two here and there. So just thank you for that, because everybody that's speaking today is just great people that have decided to donate their time too. So the fact that I can now send them a $5 thank you card or something like that. I gave away the surprise. I was going to surprise them, but I just want to kick it off by saying thanks for being here, for one. And two, if you already know what community music therapy is, if you've already been bitten by the bug, you know that this day is about to be amazing, because we have some very kind people that have written and spoken lots of different words about these ideas, that have done some cool creative projects that are what was super great to me is when I reached out to everyone, I was like, these are my people. They don't know me from anyone else. And they're so kind to be like, yeah, sure, I'll hop on a Zoom. I'll talk to you about this, your crazy idea. And everybody, again, why they're my people as well is the ego is, we all have to deal with our own ego and arrogance and things like that, but everybody is really here for this purpose of community music therapy, and why it makes such a big difference to the people that we get the opportunity to walk alongside in whatever facilities we're working in, whatever communities we're working in. And that's why today we're talking about what the heck community music therapy is, how it might work in your little slice of the world, and some brave clinicians that are going to share stories about how they failed, things that didn't go well today. That's, again, just like how this is an unconference, just like how community music therapy avoids being defined, being upfront about things that have not worked and being upfront about the challenges, and not pretending that there's not difficult things to negotiate through all of this. So in lieu of me blabbering on for more today, I'm going to try and be super quiet, even though you'll see me like I'm at church in the background while everybody's talking. I'm excited to let you all in on this first presentation, our Keynote, which I told Brynjulf to treat like this is community music therapy sermon. Tell us why we need to do this. Tell us what we need to know. Take us to what the possibilities are. So without further ado, and again, they all told me, I made them send me their bios, but they all were like, yeah, I mean, all that info, if you want to know more about why they're, important and the professional things we have to put together, that's in the program. These are also just people that have been doing this a while and found ways to make a path and a career through this stuff too. So nobody here seems like they want to be raised up on a high pedestal. So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time telling you everything about their professional achievements, even though there's so many and they're so great. So without further ado, Dr. Stige, lead us into it, okay?
Okay, thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm really feel honored for being able to present. I'm grateful to be able to present in this conference. So I've been asked to give a kind of a primer on community music therapy. So you can go directly to the next slide, Chris. And this is the place which I'm talking from, the city of Bergen in Western Norway. And whereas one of the two master programs in music therapy in Norway is in this city, and the other one is at at University of Bergen, and the other one is at the Norwegian Academy of Music in Oslo, the capital. And Bergen, that's at the west coast, facing the Atlantic. And as you can see, it's not a big city. It's actually nothing is big in Norway, actually, except perhaps the mountains, perhaps. But it's a small country with only 5 million people. But I guess perhaps size is not the only or the main difference between your American context and my Norwegian context. When it comes to government policies, there are also kind of differences which might influence the development of community music therapy, just in different ways. In Norway, there has been, for 100 years or so, there kind of been conscious attempts, like in Sweden and Denmark, to conscious attempts of kind of regulating capitalism and to combine it with a social democracy, where you try to provide free healthcare, free education, the right to work, the right to cultural participation. And these kind of equality values are compatible with community music therapy values in some ways. So when I started to work with both practices of community music therapy and the notion of community music therapy in the early 1980s, it was not very radical in relation to national government policies, because the projects that I was working in, they were supported by the government. They were in line with the government policies on including the rights of people with disabilities for cultural participation in the community. But they were considered different in the context of music therapy. So there were debates within the discipline of music therapy. Is this really music therapy, or is it something else? So when I started working with this at 40 years ago, it was kind of supported by government practices, but not necessarily supported by everybody in the local context, of course. I was, at that time, not working in Bergen, but in a smaller town 4 hours north of Bergen, a rural area, trying to increase access for cultural participation for people with health challenges and disabilities. And even though this was supported by government policies, there were plenty of people locally who would not necessarily support this. To ask for choirs and marching bands to make space for the inclusion of people with disabilities, that's just too much, some local people would say. And they would perhaps argue that this is an idealist vision which kind of suits government in their offices in the capital, but it's not realistic in a small town or in a small community. So there would be a lot of resistance also, but at the same time, some other people supporting this. And this is perhaps the point I want to make initially, that whether or not there's government support for community music therapy practices, there will always be both support and resistance. Because it's a values-informed practice, and values are always disputed. You always need to kind of negotiate between different positions in a community. People's values and priorities are diverse, and you kind of need to take part in negotiations of values. So in this presentation, I've tried to illuminate some basic principles of community music therapy, and then I will kind of highlight some recent developments, because internationally, kind of the debates about community music therapy now are about roughly 20 years now, but there are things which are changing and developing at the moment. So I tried to highlight some of these issues, and kind of concluding these presentations with some claims and some thoughts about sustainable practice and co-creation of services. So we can go on, yeah. And in presenting this, the theoretical basis was kind of developed in my book, Culture-Centered Music Therapy, which I published in 2002. And the other, some of the ideas, also more practical ideas than published in the Invitation to Community Music Therapy 10 years later. And then I will, of course, supplement this with more recent and contemporary publications. Then we could go to the next slide, which is an important context today. It was not 20 years ago, but today it's a fact that the World Health Organization for a few years now have taken strong interest in relationships between health and the arts. And you could interpret this in two different ways. One is that there's a need within the healthcare services to complement conventional ways of working in order to provide better services for people in need. And the other dimension, which is perhaps even closer to community music therapy, is that you need to acknowledge that health is not something which is produced by the healthcare system mainly. It is something which is produced in the community and depends upon education, work conditions, the cultural life of a community. The healthcare system is only one dimension of this. So now we could go to the next and to see a video which is produced by the World Health Organization. It's from a mental health clinic in Bergen, the city where I work. And it's the story of a man who's struggling with substance use problems. He has been struggling with that for 20 years. And we will see how he found help in music therapy. And you will take notice of how this work developed from a kind of more individualized format to a more community-oriented format. So
Great.
now we could watch this video, Chris.
Det å være rusmisbruker, når du ruser deg, så går du i en egen boble. Der du bare tenker på stoff, og i alle fall gjorde jeg det. Det er ikke noe liv. Det handler om å overleve. Den beste måten jeg kan beskrive liv i rus på, det er som å sitte i en T-bane i Oslo, der du går av stopp etter stopp, og hvert stopp så henter du deg nytt stoff, så er det ned i T-bane igjen, neste stopp opp av piller, og så ned igjen, amfetamin, ned igjen. Det eneste du tenker på, det er rus. Jeg heter Arve, og jeg har vært rusmisbruker i 15-20 år. For 2 år siden, og så havnet jeg i kraftig mani-delir. Så var noe av det kraftigste det jeg sett på Haukeland, faktisk. Det var 3 måneder i delir. De vurderte å legge meg i kunstig koma, og så da hadde det vært institusjoner frem til jeg møtte Vegard, musikkterapeuten her på Britannia.
Jeg heter Vegard Vikne, og jeg er utdannet musikkterapeut ved Grieg Akademi i Bergen. Jeg møtte Arve for første gang på min jobb på psykoseavdeling, og da var han på et veldig mørkt og usammenhengende og veldig innadvendt sted. Han var vanskelig å få kontakt med på sett og vis. Han så mye ned, og han snakket veldig lavt, husker jeg. Og i starten av vår prosess i musikkterapi, så var hovedfokus å skape en trygg og avslappet atmosfære, hvor musikken og interessen og ressursene til Arve var i fokus.
Du har alltid vært der, jeg har aldri vært nær.
Du har alltid vært
der.
Vært der?
Ja.
Vært der.
Jeg har aldri vært nær.
I musikkterapi så jobber vi mye med identitet. Jeg tror at det å fokusere på sterke og friske sider, det er med på å mobilisere opp en mer positiv identitetsfølelse.
Ja, det blir stilig. Ja, det blir dødstilig.
Jeg har vært i behandling 18 ganger og aldri prøvd musikkterapi. Og det er ikke det samme som psykologtime, det er noe helt spesielt. Det gir så mye. Nå er ikke jeg bare en tidligere rusmisbruker, men jeg er faktisk en som lager sanger, og det er på en måte kan være en del av den nye identiteten min. Så det er viktig for meg.
Så det vi vet er at sterke musikalske opplevelser, spesielt sammen med andre, det utløser dopamin i hjernen, og det påvirker hjernen sitt belønningssenter. Og sånne opplevelser i en sånn tid der man går gjennom en sånn sorg, det tror jeg kan være enormt meningsfullt.
Jeg har ikke sunget foran folk før, så det både gleder og gruer meg veldig til. Men det blir en barriere å krysse da. Jeg merker min mor blir jo stolt av meg. Både det at jeg holder meg rusfri, men også det at jeg lager musikk. Og Gud, det er deg som har laget denne. Gud, så fint du synger og sånn og sånn.
Velkommen. Dette er jo første gigen.
Første gang jeg spiller foran noen, ja.
oss ned. Ser på menneskene flyter forbi. Neonlysene som tar opp all tid. Følger oss ned. Følger oss ned.
Jeg har hørt mye av det. Det var gøy. For det gledes tårer, tror jeg.
Thanks, Chris. I just start talking and then you can find the slides again. This is a movie which I found very moving, and it's also kind of illuminating a major point which I want to make, that personal recovery and social recovery are connected. His capacity to change identity from a previous drug addict to somebody who's actually writing songs and performing them, that was important to his recovery, and it needed social support and the kind of community music therapy approach in order to be realized. And this practice that you're seeing is kind of standard practice in the hospitals in Bergen, where the university where I work, we have been working quite systematically to support the hospitals around the university to implement music therapy systematically, and then to not only think about individual music therapy in the clinic, but to see how this work could be then continue out into the community and enable people to be culturally and socially active in the community. So that's kind of standard practice now in the clinics surrounding our university. So two claims which are important for me to make here is that community music therapy is not always about working with local groups. It can be, but it's not always. And it's not about prioritizing communities over individuals. It's about working with the relationships between individuals and communities. So then we can go to the next slide, which I think a basic point I want to make is how music and human rights are related. And I'd like to recommend this Routledge Companion, which was published a couple of years ago, Music and Human Rights. And I was privileged enough to be able to write a chapter there about the role of music therapy in relation to human rights. And we did discuss this issue already in the Invitation to Community Music Therapy book 12 years ago, and where we highlighted kind of how community music therapy is important to what is often called the second generation of human rights, which is, your right to education, your right to work, your right to cultural participation in a community. And community music therapy might be very important in the process of actually realizing those rights, because rights are not so much worth if you need to perform them. I mean, it's not enough that they're written down on paper. So in this book, I was kind of able to kind of continue developing my understanding of the human rights and to understand, how perhaps it's not so helpful anymore to keep talking about first generation and second generation of human rights, that you need to see how the different human rights are actually connected, and that the states have the obligation to respect, to fulfill, and to protect these rights, and then professions like music therapy could then help in performing them. So as professionals, we are both musicians and healthcare workers, and I think human rights could inform both dimensions of that work. And this is kind of, if we take this one step closer to practice, I think we all see how human rights issues are in play when we work as practitioners. For instance, when we work in mental health hospitals or in prisons, rights are sometimes restricted. Your right to have a voice, your right to have a choice, is sometimes restricted. This is very clear in the prison, but it's also clear in many mental health hospitals around the world, that the power of the experts have increased, and the power of the patient sometimes have decreased, and also the right to education, the right to participation in society is sometimes restricted for some of these people that we work with as music therapists. So part of the rationale, I think, for doing community music therapy in these contexts is just because these restrictions are disputed and problematic, and we need to challenge those restrictions. If you use prison as a clear example, your right to move freely around in society is taken away from you. And there's a reason for that, and it might be discussed, but it's kind of regulated by law, and some of us and some don't accept those regulations. But often those regulations are kind of added to those regulations are the other rights are also taken away from you, which might not be necessary at all. For instance, the right to education, or the right to kind of learn skills which you could learn when you go back before you go back to the community, etc., etc. And so there's one of the reasons why music therapists need to be in the prisons and you know, help realizing those rights which should not be taken away from these people. And if you go back to the video that we just watched, we could see, you know, that this is a discussion also in this kind of clinics. So I argue that community music therapy encourages musical participation and social inclusion, equitable access to resources, and collaborative efforts for health. And it's very hard to imagine freedom and well-being, the rights as human rights, if there is no equality or no solidarity in a society. And as Prylantensky has argued, he's a very well-known community psychologist, there's no wellness without fairness in a society. So we could go to the next. So now I've been kind of trying to outline some of the contemporary context for community music therapy, and also the human rights kind of foundation for this kind of practice. And then, of course, people start asking you, but what do you actually mean with community music therapy? How do you define it? And yeah, if you go, especially 20 years ago, when the community music therapy was a kind of new term in international music therapy, there was a lot of debates about definitions. Perhaps these debates are not so prominent today, but in either case, I have more and more kind of come to the conclusion that there's a very limited value to a definition of community music therapy, because it's a practice that develops over time and from place to place, and therefore it's a practice which changes over time. So if a definition is helpful, it's because you could start discussing it and learn from the discussion, not because it's possible to kind of pinpoint in exact terms how to define a social practice like community music therapy. But in invitation to community music therapy, the book we published 12 years ago, we did try to kind of suggest some characteristics of community music therapy, indicating that if you, perhaps you could recognize these practices without actually being able to define. It's a little bit like, I mean, it's a little bit inspired by Ludwig Wittgenstein's metaphor of family resemblances, that you could not actually define a family by defining exactly what kind of a nose people have in this family, or what kind of a hair color or mouth or whatever, because that changes from person to person. So they're kind of crisscrossing patterns of similarities, which might make you able to kind of recognize the family, but you couldn't actually define it in traditional terms. And this is kind of a similar thing, that it's kind of a family of practices, and you could kind of recognize some of the features, some of the characteristics, but they might be prominent in different ways. But some of these characteristics that we suggest is that practices are participatory. They are basically democratic. People are encouraged to take part, to make a difference. They are resource-oriented, which does not only indicate that you work with personal strength, but you also work with the resources of a community, access to resources in a community. The practices are typically ecological. You work with reciprocal relationships between persons and groups and networks in a social context. They are performative, which does not only refer to gigs and musical concerts. It refers to the fact that it's a more kind of sociological idea behind this term here, that life is not only embodied and embedded in a context, but it's also kind of enacted, that you perform yourself and you perform a community together. And also, which might be kind of surprising to some people, you might claim that it's activist and that's an important characteristic, because if limitations and problems are not only linked to the individual, but also to the community and to the society, to work with social change is a natural part of the agenda of practice. It needs to be reflective, of course, and these reflections need to be collaborative and sometimes also using other modalities than language. And it's ethics driven, and this goes back to the argument I was making about human rights-based practice. So then we could go on. And yeah, this is this is where I'm living, which might be kind of different to New York or the Great Plains in the US. And the point I just want to make is that these 7 characteristics that I just outlined, as I said, they might be prominent in different ways and to different degrees depending upon context. So they're not all the same in all contexts, but usually when you kind of encounter something which you would talk about as community music therapy, you will probably recognize at least most of these characteristics as a pattern. Okay. Then I want to share a few reflections on the ecological dimension of this. And we could just go to the next slide. Because, I mean, the English term community, which is not so easy to translate to my own language, by the way, or not to many other languages either. That's one of the interesting dimensions of this English term, that it's so multifaceted. There are so many dimensions to the word community. And we might understand it in several ways. This kind of geographical notion that community as a neighborhood, it's a kind of relational notion that ties and obligations that people might have. And it's also this kind of personal level to it, the sense of community. You feel that you belong. And all of this, I think we shouldn't marry ourselves or get married to any one of those, but kind of keep this notion open and to see which of these dimensions are most important and most relevant in my context. I also want to make the point that to many people, the notion of community is kind of a positive thing. and often it is. But we must not forget that community, I mean, all kind of social relationships between people can also be oppressive and problematic and difficult. So I think we need to think about community as a resource, and all resources, they might sometimes be helpful and sometimes they might create problems. So it's a necessary resource in our lives, but it's not necessarily positive all the time. So we need to kind of pay attention to the possible negative aspects of community as well. One way of thinking about these relationships is the ecological model that Uri Bronfenbrenner, American psychologist, developed already in the 1970s. He had a very famous book in 1979 and then developed further in 2005, where he distinguished, in 79 between micro, meso, exo, and macro systems, and then in 2005, or later than 79, also added the fifth dimension, the chrono. And the idea here is that you need to kind of understand that human relationships are organized at different levels. I mean, the microsystem level is, a kind of smaller situation like a music therapy room or a classroom, or where a small group of people have relationships and activities together. And the meso system is more like when you have relationships and interactions between different microsystems. Like, for instance, when you go to school, the relationship between school and the home is a meso system relationship. And exo is the fact that very many of the things that happen at the micro and meso level depend upon processes and decisions made, for instance, in a community council where perhaps you're not a member yourself, but they make decisions which might influence the micro and meso. And all of this, as I started talking about the political differences between the US and Norway, all of this is informed and supported or not supported by a macro system where you have certain politics and certain values and certain cultural practices. And you have the chrono dimension. This changes over time. These dynamics, these relationships change over time. I wanted to make this point that you could think about those micro, meso, exo, and macro in the case of Arve, the video that we saw, that his relationships at the microsystem level, at the music therapy room, in the clinic, developed his relationship to music, which again then became a resource in a meso system perspective. It changed his relationship to his mother and his mother's relationship to him. And all of this was, of course, depending upon decisions made at the exo system level, because the clinic director had decided that he wanted music therapy in this clinic, and this was supported at a higher level by the university hospital, etc., etc. And again, all of this is supported at the macro level by national guidelines recommending music therapy. These possibilities, they change over time. So the whole point here is that when we work with community music therapy, our notion of music, it's a stimulus, yes. It's communication between individuals, yes. But those two notions, they are too limited to kind of capture what you're doing with music in community music therapy. It's a social practice where you create possibilities for actions in specific situations. So all of this invites reflections on, you know, how we understand music in our lives. And one term which I've tried to work with and develop during the years, over the years, is the term of health musicking, starting with Christopher Small's notion of musicking, indicating, thinking about music not as a noun, not as an object, but as a practice, as a situated practice. And if you relate this to health, you could see that the possibilities they have biological roots. We all have this proto-musicality, this communicative musicality, which kind of have a biological basis. Is a social, cultural basis here. We all have access to resources in the community with various musical traditions, various musics. And we have a personal relationship to music developed as musicianship during our lifetime. And all of these kind of biological, cultural, and personal processes, they kind of link into musicking as a situated practice in a specific context. And there's unity and there's diversity then to the musicking, the music making together, because at the same time as you belong to a group or to a community, you could also be an individual in that context, have a different role from the others, and have a personal experience which also might differ from the others. So I mean, just to kind of let's try now to sum up and invite some questions and comments. So I've been trying to show that community music therapy is not always about larger groups. It can be, but it's not always. And it's not about prioritizing communities over individuals, but to build relationships between individuals and communities. And we need to understand this in relation to citizenship, because in a way that's one of the really important things that we're working with in community music therapy, to make people's possibility to be a member of a community and to make a difference in a community and to belong in a community. So that's kind of to realize the right to citizenship. And if we go on, this is, as many other human rights, this needs to be performed, and in able to perform this need or this right, you might need to support people at an individual level, to support the agency and identity of that person before it's possible actually to take part in the community, which is, I think, what we saw in the video with Arve. I just want to make that point and go on. We all see this when we interact with babies, you know, that care and communication are clearly related. This is my grandson, by the way, but that's not the important point of this photograph. I just want to make this, you know, that kind of combination of care and communication is sometimes basic. Before you can be a citizen, you actually need to be able to participate in communication. So this is something which we explored in the book Where Music Helps, where you had several case studies exploring this kind of combination of care and citizenship. And care can then be to acknowledge silent participation, you know, people who just take part only a little bit, you know, adventurous participation, people who really want to make a difference. Of course, you could even have the case of more conventional participation. And sometimes that's part of a process of community music therapy to make it more possible for people to take part conventionally in the community. But at the same time, again, we work with the individuals, we work with the groups, but we work with the community too. And we might need to kind of expand the idea of what conventional participation actually means. That there's a human rights perspective as a foundation. The PREPARE acronym indicating ecological and critical turn in music therapy. Community music therapy is expanding the notion of music therapy, but it's not necessarily an antithesis to individual therapy. And sometimes the individual agency and the capacity for conventional participation needs to be nurtured, but very often also we need to work in an activist way with the community to change the conditions for participation for people. So I guess my time is up, and it's good if we could have a couple of questions, Chris. Can you help us with that?
One question. Can you say more about before you can be a citizen, you need to be able to engage in communication? What does this mean for those with, like you were saying, people that communicate differently with major communication needs?
Yeah, because that's a very good question, and the example is extremely good. I mean, when you have large communication challenges, of course, there's huge responsibility for the community and the persons surrounding this person to do whatever is possible in technology, in practices that can kind of make communication possible in spite of all of those challenges. So I'm absolutely not trying to say that all we do is to focus on this individual and try to make this individual learn how to communicate in the community. But so I'm just trying to say that you have to very often work in two directions. I think I can use an example from my own very first experiences in the early 1980s, where I worked with people with intellectual disabilities, and they communicated strongly that they wanted to be part of the marching band of the local community. But I realized that at the same time as they had this dream, they had so little musical experience because they have not been given music opportunities that they didn't even know how to play a basic beat together with other people. So we assumed that it would be impossible to make collaboration with the local musicians possible before at least you can play a basic beat together. So we work with that, work with individual skills and group skills in improvising and making music together. And after a few months, we were able to make music together in a basic beat. So that's what I mean. And then you needed to work from the perspective of the individual and group first. And then we started to communicate with the local community and the local musicians, and we realized that the problem didn't stop there because they were not too interested. They were scared from collaborating with these people, and they had attitudes that kind of stopped collaboration. So then we realized that we need to work with these attitudes. We need to work with the community. We need to work at a much broader level. So this is what I'm trying to say, that you might need to kind of prepare the individual or prepare the group, and you might need to prepare the community before you could make those connections possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have one other question someone wrote in that I think also relates to, and again, I think I'm very grateful for everybody, the way this is queued up, because I do think when we think about, one of the reflection points in the guide was using Stewart's matrix for thinking about what are all these people's different needs? How do we look at them from the micro and the macro and all of these things, like you're saying, of it might be looking at different things in different places. One interesting question someone asked Olivia asked, I have a lot of clients that don't want to perform or share music back with their community, like friends or family, etc. Should we encourage performance, or is the fact that they made the music enough? So thinking about those performative musicking aspects.
Yeah. It's a very important question, very good question, because I think it's a common misunderstanding because that it needs to be performance. And we have this misunderstanding a lot in my country because these performances are so visible. I mean, they're public events, so people know about them, but you don't know what's happening in the clinic or in somebody's home, or but yes, some people have, excellent possibilities for growth when they can perform in a gig, and some people that don't want to do it. So of course, yes, it's enough. It might be for some people, it might absolutely be enough to just do music with some other people in a music cafe or something where you don't perform, but you do have a community by doing something together with people.
Right. I think it relates to the Brynjulf, the title of the method, recreative, too. It's although you might be playing music and doing something recreative, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a physical performance. And like you're saying, and you're thinking about the context of community throughout all of that as well.
And also, sometimes people want to kind of communicate their ideas to a broader community, but they don't want to perform in that sense, in the kind of musical sense. So then they can perform in a sociological sense. They could perform their self by, for instance, recording a song, which can be shared.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, we really need to think of the word performance here, not as a musical concept, but as a sociological concept. So it's a very important question. Gigs and those kind of concerts and performances, that's just one part of the whole thing and not good for everybody.
Let's see. Lane said, mental illnesses often curtail a person's motivation to claim their human rights to self-expression for an abundance of reasons. So thanks. That was a nice comment, but we got a couple of questions here too.
But again, I mean, I just want to make a comment.
Go ahead, please go.
Yeah, because again, this speaks to the need for kind of catering for individual needs and community needs, as I've been trying to say in this presentation, that we're not necessarily kind of creating oppositions between focusing on individual needs and community needs. And what we have seen in Bergen is that when the hospitals started to give more possibilities for clinical music therapy and treatment of individuals through music therapy, the request for community music therapy services did not go down, they did go up, because people then started to develop relationships to music and to kind of starting to claim their human rights more. So it's a very important point being made here, and one of the things we need to work with.
The last couple of questions from the Ash Ortiz family, we've got two. Gabriella asks, I'm curious about your use of the word citizen. Could you elaborate on the choice of like that construct of the word and choosing citizen specifically?
Yeah, I guess I talked about citizenship, the membership of a society, which is, of course, is a legal issue, but it's also a social issue. So I was mainly here talking about the social dimension of it, that to be a member of a community is something which is performed, but it's not only performed by that person, but by the whole
the dynamic, yeah.
Dynamic between the person and the community. And the arts is a kind of typical example about how people's rights to participation and to membership might be restricted if you have these very narrow definitions of quality and narrow definitions of what even music is. So this is a whole discourse, both within music therapy, but also within music education. How could we as musicians, help people who are marginalized and kind of have limitations to the possibilities of being part of a community? How could we use the arts to help people, claim their citizenship?
Well, that leads really well into Jesse's comment that I also feel like we could ask Jesse's question at every juncture across today. So it'd be good to hear your thoughts. Jesse said, I appreciated your thoughts on enacting creative engagement as a means of challenging and reclaiming human rights. What would you say when this act of doing that brushes up against the restrictions of an institution? Like, how can we be anti-oppressive without being against our institutions and work collaboratively? And that's going to hit directly on multiple people's topics after you too, but what are your thoughts as well?
Yeah, you have very good questions, because this is very difficult, isn't it? Because sometimes our values and the goals that we're trying to work with, they are not necessarily in line with the institution. So there's no simple answer to this. I started a presentation about kind of reminding ourselves about how there's always these debates and negotiations about values and priorities, and this is very clear when you work with an institution, and I think there are several ways of dealing with it. Sometimes it's almost impossible. I mean, because the kind of there's so much discrepancy.
I can't hear you. You're going to need to wait.
Your values and the institution's values, but sometimes you could kind of create pockets of possibilities because some institutions, some more than others, would allow some kind of counter cultures to grow. So sometimes you can be a counterculture within your institution and work in that way. Sometimes you can refer to the human rights, United Nations, or government policies, or other documents or values which kind of can challenge the values of the institution and create debates and reflections in the institutions. It's not easy at all, but it's something which we very often have to work with.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for your time and helping us kick off this talk. I mean, just the ideas, the invitation to community music therapy, I think everybody was nodding and locked in. So I'm just so grateful for your time, and that everybody here today can bounce off of these ideas. What a great way to get us started. So if you all haven't, whenever you go later to reflect on just all the things for even just fulfilling the CMTE, read these chapters. You just got like 7 more book recommendations in the presentation as well. So that's my little surprise after. I think we should all start a community music therapy book club after this as a way to keep the conversation going. But I think we can let you off the hook. Brynjulf, thank you again for your time. And I think we can roll right up to Dr. Murphy and Dr. Kruger here, who've got another presentation that I think, again, relates directly, again, to what you were saying, directly to a lot of these questions that people are asking, and relates directly to the paper that I put in the chat. I'll drop it in the chat again as well, but their article in Voices last year with a whole team, including, multiple people here on the call, about what does it look like when we adapt community music therapy to US-based contexts. And I think whether you're tuning in from the US, like most people I'm assuming will be, but I know we have a global audience that will be watching after, what are the things you need to think about when, our laws restrict things, or, we're dealing with, I love that quote of community is necessary, but it's not always necessarily a good thing. What a great, dichotomy to think about. So if you all are ready, I think Kathy and Vigo, let's go. We're ready.